This encounter takes place in Oak Grove, South Carolina in 2014. I was walking home from work at about 11 o'clock one night. I lived at the end of a road just outside of town that had no streetlights, and it was fairly dark out that night. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness at that point, and luckily I could see well enough to walk without tripping over anything. Looking back, it was an unusually quiet night. No crickets chirping or frogs croaking. I live in Oak Grove, South Carolina, which is just to the west of Columbia. The area beyond where I live is mostly undeveloped woods with patches of farmland. At least, it used to be that, back until they started building houses on every available lot several years ago. I guess people need places to live working in the city, but I hated it. The good thing is, though, there's not much crime here, just the occasional occurrence of a break-in or vandalism. Anyway, this particular night seemed a bit odd. I can't really tell you why, but something about it just seemed off. Like, I wasn't as comfortable walking home as I normally would be. So, just to calm my mind, I stopped walking and listened to see if anything seemed strange, but nothing. I remember thinking that it must have just been my imagination playing with me. I walked on for a few more minutes, and that's when I noticed a dog-sized shaped thing sitting on top of the rusting remains of what looked to be a cover for an old well. The shape seemed to be looking my way, even watching me intently, but it stayed where it was. I'm even pretty sure I heard it let out a low growl every now and then. Obviously, the dog's growls made me nervous, so I picked up my pace, trying to get ahead of whatever it was, but that turned out to be difficult. What happened was that even though I had passed by the area where it had been sitting, the animal stood up and started to follow me at an incredibly fast rate, much faster than a human could move. For the next few minutes, it continued following me and occasionally snarling and snapping at me while I tried to hurry my pace and tried to outrun it. I knew that I was no match for the dog if it decided to attack, so then I ran as fast as my legs could go. And then finally I reached the safety of my back porch, got in the house, and slammed and locked the sliding glass door behind me, panting heavily. The dog creature was now nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear sounds in the distance, growling and snarling. All I could think of was it going to break into my house and eat me? I was still breathing hard when the phone in my pocket started vibrating loudly and scared the hell out of me. I honestly think my heart skipped a few beats. I fumbled for the phone and answered it. Hello? Hey, check this out. I'm at the end of your road now. It was my friend Sean, who was on his way to my house to hang out. He kept talking, unaware that I was still trying to catch my breath. And there's this creature just like sitting here, crouching. I could hear him laughing. There's this dog in the middle of the road. It's like watching me. It's huge. Like, seriously, something looks to be wrong with it. Like, it's half dog and half human. It's so weird. I'm going to try to get a picture of it, so hold on just a second while I open the camera. The thought of Sean getting closer to that thing was terrifying me, but before I could even say anything, he kept talking, and it sounded like he had the camera out and on the dogman. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there in silence in my house listening to him talk to the dogman, who I'm pretty sure I could hear growling through the phone. And that's when I heard the dogman suddenly let out this loud scream, and I heard Sean yell, "Wah!" The next thing I heard was what sounded like breaking glass and a thud, followed by Sean screaming again. And that's when I panicked, thinking that he had been attacked by this dog creature. Our phones were still connected, but now there was no sound coming through to me at all. I decided I had no choice but to head outside and head over to find Sean and see what had happened. And that's when I saw the dogman sitting right next to his car, making a strange clicking sound with his throat. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, but it was hunched over like an ape, covered in black fur. It was terrifying to look at. I could see that Sean was still in the driver's seat, but his phone was laying outside the car on the street, and the glass was shattered on his window. The dogman must have smashed through his window and threw his phone off to the side. I decided that if I could get to the car, then maybe I'd have the chance of getting Sean to focus and drive away from there. Everything happened so fast, I almost had no time to react, so I just ran. Suddenly, the dogman stood up straight and gave a disturbing, deep growl. Its head was facing in my direction, so I ran as fast as I could to get inside the car. I felt like it was right behind me when I reached the door and jumped inside. "Go!" I yelled to Sean, who luckily snapped out of it and slammed his foot on the accelerator and peeled out of there. Later, I asked him why in the world did he think it would be a good idea to stop and take a picture of a dogman. He told me that never in a million years did he suspect that he had actually come across a dogman. He thought it was just some old mangy dog or a trick of the light that was making it look like it was half human. Days have now passed, and we don't really talk about it ever. It just seems like we've both forgotten about it, or maybe it's just that we're too scared to bring it up and say it out loud to each other. That has to be it. Honestly, I can tell you for certain that I haven't forgotten about it. Not one bit. I should probably ask him if he's been able to forget about it. This story took place in Carbondale, Illinois in 2008. My father had been working the night shift at the factory for many years. As kids, we barely saw him except for when we all had dinner together after school, which was right before he headed off for work. He was such a great storyteller and always loved to tell us stories about the plant and make up any crazy story that he could ever think of to entertain us, even if it was super crazy ridiculous. However, I'll never forget the one story he told us when I was about 10. He began by telling us it had been a normal day. He'd gotten up and done his morning routine, brushed his teeth, read the paper, and then headed off to work as usual. When he arrived at the plant, he'd started his usual routine, unloading parts, putting them on the conveyor belt, etc., etc. The day continued to go normally, but by around 10 o'clock at night, most of the previous workers had left for the night. My dad hadn't taken a break since about 8 o'clock at night, but it wasn't unheard of since his job only required one person in his area. The man working one station over that night was new to my dad, and since their job can get monotonous and boring, my dad reached out to him to take a break together. So a little after midnight, they headed outside to the area with a picnic table to catch a smoke and talk about sports and other things to help the time go more quickly. The man mentioned that he had a dog at home, and my dad said he always wanted one too. "Yeah," the man said, "I just wish that they were more obedient." A few minutes later, my dad asked about the breed of his dog, and the guy responded by saying it was a black German shepherd. That really piqued my father's interest because he had always wanted that same dog. A few minutes passed, and just as my father was about to resume the conversation with the guy, he saw a shadowy figure move out of the corner of his eye and off towards the edge of the break area. He squinted into the darkness and was shocked to see a dog-like creature off in the distance. It wasn't like any dog he'd ever seen, though, before, but it looked dog-like enough that he thought that maybe he had just been seeing things with a trick of the light or something. Like the dog in his mind just wasn't one that he could comprehend. But there were too many things wrong with this dog, from its height to its posture to everything in between, basically, he said. It had eyes that glowed an eerie red and seemed to be mostly hairless, with only patches of hair here and there on its torso, and heavier on its face, and the head was ugly, like a mangy dog. He said its lips were completely black and held shut tightly as if it was suffocating its teeth from within. Even the eyes seemed unusual, he said. They didn't seem natural at all, but my dad also said he couldn't figure out exactly why. The dog stood about half a head taller than my dad and had strong dog-like muscles on its body, but its legs were long in proportion to the back, with a tail that seemed long and abnormally muscular at the end. Though he was scared out of his mind, my father says that all these things happened within seconds and there wasn't really time for any thought other than what he saw. He knew immediately that this dog was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, and just by looking at it you could tell it meant trouble. All this took maybe 5 or 10 seconds to occur, and then the dog creature took a step forward towards my dad and his coworker, and my dad said, "What is that dog?" After hearing this, the dog walked its way over and got closer to my dad and his coworker. It didn't growl or show any aggression, but it stared at my dad with those eerie red eyes which sent chills up his spine, he said. And now it began to expose its teeth. It showed them through its closed lips that were slightly open, and they were sharp and pointy like an animal's, not even remotely human-looking. My dad began shaking at this point, and he said he could feel the dog's intense stare looking at him. The dog creature then stared at my father's coworker for a second and then turned back to my dad again. But before either of them could react, it walked away, seemingly uninterested in my dad or his friend anymore, but they were far from relieved. They were afraid it wasn't going anywhere for good and that it might just be going somewhere temporarily, like it had sized them up and was planning for something awful to happen, maybe even bringing more back with it. My dad said he couldn't stay there another moment, and he slowly motioned for his coworker to follow him, and they began slowly walking back to the factory. After a few slow steps, then they ran most of the way back and didn't even look back for fear of what could be behind them. As soon as they got to the door, they turned around and saw no dog-like creature behind them. Nothing had followed them back, like he thought might happen. He was relieved that it seemed to be staying behind, but he still said he didn't trust that it wouldn't show up again. After telling a few other coworkers about the dog creature later that night, they all told him that there was no dog at the factory grounds like he described, or any dog for that matter. There wasn't really even anything near the factory building either, no houses, just an empty field which led back to a small forest far off in the distance. So then my father got to thinking. If this dog-like creature had come from somewhere nearby, then it must have made its way through the woods undetected. But not only did it go through the woods undetected, but it also got inside the fence at the factory without anyone noticing it. He then said, "I don't think it's something in between. It's definitely a dogman." My father was adamant about calling it a dogman and not just some dog, because he knew that dogs don't look like that, and he's never seen eyes like that. Also, the description of what he saw didn't exactly match any normal dog. Anyway, as soon as my father heard about all this, he immediately went to an old friend who happened to have had an encounter with a dogman himself. This old friend confirmed what my dad described and said it sounded exactly like what happened to him years ago, but he also told him that dogmen are very real, and they definitely live deep in the forest. He said that they only reveal themselves periodically, and not everyone will see one in their lifetime. This friend also said that he felt the dogman knows and chooses who can see them, but he didn't know why. He also said dogmen are programmed to not kill people, only to investigate and watch them. My dad asked the man what the dogman wanted and why did it come and show itself to him. And his friend said that the dogmen usually come out to check on people that live and work near the woods, just to watch them and see what they're up to. He also said dogman sightings are not frequent, since dogmen don't really reveal themselves for no reason. They only show themselves when they feel it's necessary. So the man looked at my dad and told him, "It's checking up on you, but I don't know why." So just to be safe, my dad always made sure he always stayed inside after dark from then on whenever he worked the night shift, which was basically always. And sometime later, my dad moved out of Carbondale, Illinois altogether, with us all in tow. I don't think he ever got over that experience, and I honestly think he feared one of us being stalked and killed maybe, even though his friends said that they don't do that. But I guess it's hard to feel safe when you're dealing with something you don't understand at all. Something you can't even barely explain to people. I remember vividly that night that my dad told us the story. His face looked unlike it had ever had before. It was intense, and I could tell that he was still scared after all that time. Luckily, I've never had to encounter a dogman in my life, and I'm still only in my early 20s, but I'm definitely aware of where and where not to go when it's dark. Please be careful. Everybody out there, please stay safe.